Hello. Thanks, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us on tracking small business recovery. I think we have a great hour of content ready for you. And as a little departure, if you've attended the Oculus Virtual Roundtable series before, I think what's going to be very helpful for today is we're going to set up what we mean by small business recovery. And in fact, a lot of research has gone into this from a couple of our panelists. So to begin with, I'm going to turn things over and we're going to do a quick presentation from Scott Monaco, who is on our analytics team. Scott?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Is the screen perfect? Okay. Excellent. Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Monaco. I sit on the analytics team here at Oculus. I'm going to spend just a few minutes on the Small Business Recovery Index. And Tim, if you go to the first slide. So one of the first questions we asked ourselves in thinking about tracking small business recovery is how can we accurately measure in real time the resilience of a small business in a post-pandemic environment? It's a question that many of you are grappling with. And it's a tough one to answer for a lot of different reasons. Two in particular stand out. First is the unprecedented level of market volatility, which has made it such that understanding what a status quo looks like is very difficult. And the second is the insufficiency of credit data, whereby the usual market signals and credit metrics that have defined creditworthiness have been obscured and in some cases just made useless kind of overnight. And that's of course due to the pandemic, but it's also due to the government's heavy involvement to step in and help millions of borrowers defer debt payments on mortgages and other loan products. And so we live in a world now where millions of Americans have skipped debt payments, yet at the same time, average credit scores are at an all-time high. And so to help us kind of understand this dichotomy, we really wanted just to create a framework for understanding the nature and the resilience of small business recovery with the underlying assumption that recovery is going to be uneven on a geographic and industry basis. And so that's exactly what we did. We built the Small Business Recovery Index. It's a relative scoring that looks at a combination of external data sources that includes macroeconomic indicators from housing and employment to consumer foot traffic and credit card spend, along with internal Oculus data that provides a nice micro foundation down to the individual borrower level, where we have a unique view on things like application volume and average daily balances and cash flow that's based on our wealth of bank statement data. And so the combination of these two allows us to create this index that provides a timely and accurate pulse of the market. And so Tim, if you move to the next slide, we can start to see some of the results of the small business recovery scores. Here is a county level animation of small business recovery scores that's based on a month over month change since the start of the pandemic. And we can see real differences in recovery as the months lead into the summer and into the current winter. The dark shades of blue in this map indicate lower small business recovery scores compared to the lighter ones. Tim, if you move to the next slide, we can see small business recovery scores on an industry basis, just for a handful of industries. And right away, we can see that this recovery is actually following a very different pattern, very different path from previous recoveries. And that's due to the unusual nature of the downturn. Of course, previous major recessions have tended to originate with high interest rates in the construction and manufacturing industries, which are also typically the first to rebound as rates fall. But that's not exactly what happened here. As you all well know, the parts of the economy that were hit hardest are the ones in which services are provided in person. And so this just goes to show that this recovery is just following a very different path than previous ones. And therefore, we think it's important to be able to integrate new perspectives of the economy and its resulting recovery. Tim, next slide. And so just to wrap up before I pass it off to Sabrina, the Small Business Recovery Index allows us to talk about what a K-shaped recovery actually means and provide some context around it. And so we started to see some correlations with the index to some recent outcomes, such as the most recent presidential election and COVID case and death rates. And so, going forward, you may have noticed in that county graph that there are certain pockets of the country, in particular the coastal areas and high density urban areas that have been hit hardest. But, we're really excited to capture going forward some real differences in recovery, especially as vaccination rates increase and the level of government stimulus continues to deploy. there's an abnormally high level of savings in the country right now, which suggests that there's a large amount of pent up consumer demand for goods and services. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Sabrina, who will talk about the effect of fintech on PPP.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to take a few minutes to introduce you to research relating to the small business recovery, or lack thereof, which I'm doing with colleagues at NYU Stern, as well as David Snitkoff, who's here with us today. Our research highlights the power, I think, for economists like me to do our job of learning about the economy by leveraging large data sets from fintech startups, which of course are often companies that are built around novel data and around competencies to process and analyze them. So this project in particular uses data from Lendio, Acrolis, Middesk, and in future work will incorporate data from Enigma and Cabbage as well. Our project starts, next slide, please. Our project starts from the observation that during the COVID-19 crisis, minority and especially Black-owned small businesses closed at much higher rates than white-owned businesses. And partly in response to this catastrophe, Congress created the Paycheck Protection Program to provide forgivable loans to small businesses. And although these loans were guaranteed by the government, they were processed and dispersed by private lenders. Media reports quickly raised concerns that minority-owned businesses were struggling to access PPP loans. So seeing this, we decided to ask whether lenders differ in their propensity to extend PPP loans to minority-owned businesses, and if so, why? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I just want to highlight a couple of our main results so far for you here. So this graph on the x-axis at the bottom shows the share of PPP borrower firms whose owner is predicted to be Black. And we spend a lot of time showing that we can do this accurately. And so this is the sample of firms where we can confidently predict the race of the owner. On the y-axis, we have the lender type, and in parentheses, the number of loans they made that are used in this analysis. They total about 3.4 million of the total 6 million PPP loans, with the share here for each lender happily being very close to its overall share. So what do you see? What we see is that fintech lenders make close to 16% of their loans to Black-owned businesses. They're followed by community development financial institutions, which note made 10 times fewer loans. The lenders with the lowest rates of lending to Black-owned businesses at the top are small and medium-sized banks. And I want to mention here that the shares seem relatively large, and that's because this includes contractors and sole proprietors. So the share of Black-owned employer firms in the economy and the PPP is unfortunately much smaller. Okay, next slide. So now the question you may be thinking about, it's what we're thinking about, is what is the reason or reasons for these disparities? So this graph shows a different model that controls for a number of potential initial explanations. So here, the level of numbers on the x-axis is not very meaningful because there are so many controls in this model. So one obvious story is that these disparities reflect loan size, which is closely tied to business size and determines the fees the lender gets. But it turns out that controlling in a very granular way for the loan size just doesn't affect the disparity or the difference across lenders really much at all. Neither does the industry, and neither does the location. So here we're looking within a city, but we actually find similar results looking within a zip code or even a census tract. Okay, next slide, please. So the last thing we've done is then ask whether maybe this is about bank relationships. So far, we've matched about 250,000 PPP borrowers to bank statements from business checking accounts. And it turns out that conditional on being a client of a particular traditional lender, like say a top 4 bank, we find that Black-owned businesses are much more likely to actually get a fintech loan. And they're also less likely to get a PPP loan from their own bank. So this tells us that bank relationships don't explain the disparity between fintechs and traditional lenders in the propensity to provide PPP loans to Black-owned small businesses. So in ongoing work, we're going to explore other channels. And I'd love to hear folks' ideas for what those channels might be. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sabrina. I think that really sets us up well for this discussion. So with that, I am going to turn over the roundtable to the capable hands of our moderator, Amias Garrity. Amias?
Excellent. And this is so interesting, and so glad to be here to have this conversation. And so first of all, just want to thank Sabrina for this research, and Scott. I think, there's a lot that we talk about that is around the theory, the practice, and insights that we might get, but this is a really great opportunity to have actual data in front of us, and actual data provokes really good questions. So I'd like to, before I turn it over to David and then Brock and Yelena, I want to just highlight that these two pieces of research, right, the Small Business Recovery Index and the racial disparities in PPP lending are, they're sort of not obviously telling the same story, but I think they are a really important part of getting the story right as we look forward the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months. Because we know that small businesses are hugely important to the economy in a general sense, and then even more important to the kind of micro fabric of economies in particular communities, right? So you could have GDP be constant and have large companies sort of wiping the table with small companies, but that wouldn't hold constant. You could not have that same thing be true for small communities and for neighborhood and city level. So it is really important that we understand the small business recovery with granularity, and it's really important that we understand what happens in particular along the fault lines that exist in our society, race and education, and income status, and how those affect access to capital. Because whatever is true in the general sense about small versus large businesses, it appears to be true again between Black-owned businesses and white-owned businesses. And so these themes really are, I think, connected to getting the story right about what's happening, getting the story right about what's happening with sufficient granularity to actually understand what we might do about it. And for me, I think this is a really exciting conversation on that topic. So we'll talk a little bit less about the wonders of Oculus, the company, or Lendio, the company, and a little bit more just about what is happening in the economy and how can we understand it. So with that, I'd like to first start, because David, you obviously sit on top of the analytics department in Oculus, and we're a key contributor to this paper. So I'd like to just turn it over to you first, David, and talk a little bit more about what it was like to go through this process, and in particular, if there was anything that was particularly surprising as you collaborated with Sabrina and also created the Small Business Recovery Index.
Sure. Thanks, Amias, and everyone. If we haven't met before, I'm David Snitkoff. I run the analytics group at Oculus, and it has been a super interesting process to work with Scott and Sabrina and all of Sabrina's colleagues at NYU on this paper. What's so interesting, if you look at that graph that Sabrina showed, the first one, the disparity is very, very large. And we even had a conversation the other day of all of the collaborators on the phone, just debating maybe 20 different ideas of why that disparity could be so large. And even looking at some of the stories that you see in the popular media about it, because a lot of people have looked just at the publicly available data on PPP, and they've come to some similar indications about racial disparity and access to capital. But the reasons why are really debatable. And a lot of people have put forward this thesis of, well, maybe it's because Black-owned businesses didn't have the same previous relationship with their banks, and so they didn't have access because of that. And one of those graphs that Sabrina showed that that's not the case. Even if you look at people who had that previous banking relationship, which we were able to do with the greater data that we can see, even still there was that disparity. And so we're thinking, and we're still thinking through all the potential channels and vectors for why these things may be the case. And I think the most fascinating piece of it is that just the incredible disparate change in the pace of the recovery across the entire country, geographically, racial groups, economic groups, different types of industries, different types of consumers. Nothing is the same, right? At even at every level you can think of. So as we hopefully recover, and COVID cases are going down, COVID vaccines are going up, we will recover from a public health standpoint. What's important to do economically is to make sure that we, in the Joe Biden sense, build back better. Can we actually recover from this period of time in a way where a rising tide can lift all boats? And I think to do that, what a lot of this data shows, both the Ocrolus Index and the work that we're doing with NYU, and a lot of the data that I know our other panelists have looked at, is just looking at all these different groups and all these different interconnected dynamics throughout the economy and thinking, how do we actually create the opportunity for everyone, and how do we provide access to capital, and how do we make sure that we're doing it in a fair and transparent way?
I'm going to turn it to Brock next. So for those who aren't familiar, Lendio is a small business brokerage. And so Brock is CEO and founder of Lendio, and his job is really to help small businesses find the right capital provider. And Brock, if you would, in addition to other observations that you want to make about this data, would love to hear just what the Lendio experience was like over the last 12 months. I remember a story right at the beginning of the pandemic where you actually made an announcement of staffing way up to handle the volume and help people. So good job, thank you. But tell us about riding this roller coaster and any observations that you can make about what it was like helping small businesses navigate this process, and whether there's any additional insight that you have about both about the recovery and about the disparate impact that we see in Sabrina's work.
Well, thanks for having me on the panel, and I love the data that's been shared so far. Scott and Sabrina, you've done a great job, and I could be satisfied on this panel just listening to you and go through those statistics because they're so interesting. And clearly this is they talk about these PPP loans and how there's a large focus on the smallest of small businesses and obviously minority owned businesses. And we can see why, during the pandemic, so much, and this K recovery where you get the Walmarts of the world and the Amazons of the world that really grow significantly, but at the expense of, many of these retail shops and restaurants and others that are in your local community that you can't go and shop at because of restrictions in certain communities. And I'm extremely fearful of that the type of impact, negative impact that we have on the long term of our communities. And so I think that PPP, there's been a lot of talk around the PPP loans, and we played a big role in that in the first round, and are deep or neck deep right now in this round right now. We've had over about 150,000 businesses now secure a lot of money, I appreciate. There's a lot of things that I've been very critical of the SBA on, but one thing I appreciate about what they're trying to do is they are trying to focus on these smallest to small businesses and minority-owned businesses, and I think fintech gets a bad rap with a lot of things, but I do that those stats were amazing to be able to see the impact that they have had on the Black-owned businesses, and that story needs to be told. But I can't articulate how much. Like we received about 10,000 5-star reviews, which were basically like 10,000 businesses that were giving like personalized thank you notes to us around like how much of an impact these PPP loans had on their business. We got about 500 video testimonials of businesses that were literally emotional. We had people singing, making up songs, talking about, Lendio and like, you should see some of these, but because they're in such a difficult position. We've tried to, we did rally. We last time we hired 250, this time we've hired about 1,000 people. And the reason which has been its own challenge, by the way, but the reason we are doing that is today there are other, back last year there weren't other loan options available. Now fortunately, there are lenders that are lending again, but bar none, today the best capital that a business owner can get is a PPP loan, and there might be other loans that you can add on top of that, and so we're rallying to help those businesses get access to that capital and hopefully be able to keep the fabric of our local communities intact from getting those loans.
I mean, I love Brock, I hope you have on your website. I haven't checked a super cut of those thank you videos. That would be an uplifting moment. Maybe when Lendio's ready to have a Super Bowl ad, that's what you can use for it. So we'll all be cheering for you then. Elena, zooming out, and for those who haven't met Elena is an economist at Grant Thornton, and so her perspective is much more macro than micro. So sort of two questions for you, Elena. K-shaped recoveries are unusual, right? I mean, we can see this in the chart, but I don't think there's a deep economic literature about the idea of a K-shaped recovery. So I would love to have you comment on, when you and other macroeconomists look at, this emerging K-shaped recovery, what are the danger signs for our economy that emerge in this context? And then relatedly, what are the questions that the kind of traditional macro data sources can't answer for us as observers and policymakers and lenders about what to expect from an economy that has the characteristics that you're seeing emerge here?
Thank you, Miles, for your question, and thank you so much for letting me be here today. And thank you for Sabrina and Scott for your wonderful research and comments. I first want to start just agreeing with a lot of the sentiment here today that getting the story right is really important. And for me in my work, that's important because that helps dictate the proper policy response when we're talking about fiscal policy or monetary policy and how to help the economy recover. And as we talk about the fact that, yes, we are in a K-shaped recovery, I also want to comment that when we first hit the recession, not everyone felt a recession. Some households and some businesses were just like, what recession? And simultaneously now, some households and some businesses are like, what recovery, right? So it's incredibly uneven, but it has been from the start. And you're right to say that there isn't a lot of research on this, and a lot of it does come from the fact that we have become so much more technologically advanced in the last few decades that we can have access to such great data, such an abundance of data, and we can track more things. We have a lot of great private sector indicators that are emerging, such as the one we're talking about today. But really, when the pandemic first started and we were trying to figure out, okay, what's employment going to look like next month? And we're talking, this was back in March, right? And we didn't really have much to work with because we have to wait for the next month for the employment indicators to come out. And so we really started looking at things like high frequency data from open table reservations, TSA passenger traffic through airports, all sorts of indicators on sentiment, just to get a sense of where we're heading, how big, how deep, how quick is the damage going to be. And we even looked before it hit the US, we looked to China and Europe, and at first we thought, well, maybe this will just cause some sort of trade imbalances, but that was clearly not the case. And we had, some of the biggest drops in a lot of the indicators that we were tracking. And so you ask about danger signs. I think that's a really important question, because when we do look at macroeconomic indicators such as, the unemployment rate, GDP, we are looking at aggregate figures. We're looking at averages. So we're not capturing everything that's going on using this headline rate. And, the Federal Reserve has actually made a great note of this, and a lot of the comments they've made in recent statements about they use the word inclusion, which has never been heard of before in their statements. And they're saying, it's not just about the unemployment rate. It's the unemployment rate of Black workers, it's the unemployment rate of Hispanic workers, it's the labor force participation by women who had to drop even faster out of the labor force because schools were closed and they're the primary caregivers for children. And so a lot of these more nuanced indicators became very, very important to us. And when we look at, this recovery and as we move into, herd immunity and maybe mass vaccinations come sooner than we expect, but what sort of scarring effects do we have on the economy? Scarring on small business owners, scarring on landlords, and especially the labor force, because research does show that more than 6 months unemployed has detrimental effects to potential wage gains and career paths forward. And then the educational losses to school children and the university students, that could have lifelong employment effects. I'm a millennial, graduated in the last recession, and there's a lot of research now showing how my generation really lost out on a significant wage trajectory because we graduated into the recession. So now, we have Gen Z. What's that going to look like for them 10 years down the road for their careers? And so these are some of the scarring effects that we really want to look at, because there's conversations and there's disagreements about what amount of stimulus, if you will, but really it's still just aid at this point. We're not at the stimulating part yet. But what level of aid is needed? Look, we don't need it. We have a great high, savings rate. We have, unemployment's going down. But underneath the surface, like David said, a rising tide does not lift all boats. So targeted relief is really what we're advocating for, and ensuring that we're tracking the proper indicators. And so you asked about the traditional indicators. As I mentioned, we had to get creative and just look at high frequency private sector data to work alongside traditional government data that we were looking at. And the combination of the two really helps us paint a more accurate picture of the economy as we move into this recovery, and then start talking about the stimulus and what it looks like on the other side of this recession.
Yeah, look, I mean, not to go too deep into the sort of theory of financial economics or economics more generally, but there's this massive trend in Sabrina's world over the last 40 years of what we call micro-founded models. And at the same time, the micro-founded models, so the idea that like everything should make sense at the individual actor level, and so it's been highly mathematical in the field of economics. At the same time, these micro-founded models have been like pretty weak empirically, because most of Sabrina's laughing as I attack her colleagues, but because as Yelena described, we have a world where the empirical data tends to be either small scale and experimental or large scale and so macro as to not really foot to micro foundations in the economics literature. And here, what I have, and this is what I love about the Small Business Recovery Index, is it has the capacity to be micro-founded at the level of individual firms, but still empirical and in direct dialogue with macro data that the traditional macroeconomic models and people like Yelena track. So anyway, just like a small footnote for those of you who want to geek out on the economics profession and the daily battles that I'm sure Sabrina has in her faculty meetings. So I want to pull back and make sort of two observations about what we learned last year. And I think the biggest thing, and I think there was some debate about whether this would be true or not, but the stimulus did work. It worked in ways that were, I think, much better than people who were skeptical expected. So I, for one, was very skeptical that the PPP program would be effective. I worried that it would be slow to get out. I worried that it wouldn't get to as many firms as it did. I worried that it wouldn't get to hardly any small firms. And I think those worries were mostly, there was a good track record there. But that track record was dominated by speed and size rather than by fairness or completeness. And as I think from a policy perspective, we shouldn't be surprised by that, because the PPP program was not designed to be complete and it was not designed to be fair. And by what I mean by that is it was not designed to go to every small business, and it was not designed to go to businesses that are most in need. right? It was designed to go as quickly as possible to as many small businesses as private sector actors could get through their doors. And so, this, I think, especially as we sort of move forward and think about where this means and how we can improve, we do see really encouraging signs from the scale and the reach of fintechs. But we also recognize that if we want completeness, right, the checks went to everybody. The unemployment insurance went to people who lost their jobs. So those were more complete programs or more fairness-oriented programs, whereas the PPP program was really designed to just push as much as we could. So as we go forward, one question I want to ask the group is around this movement that Yelena talked about between relief and recovery, or between relief and stimulus. And I'll start this with a quip, which someone said to me about, I guess Joe Kennedy made his money in liquor. And there's a quip that people say, which is that Joe Kennedy opened with a, fully stocked liquor warehouses the day Prohibition ended, right? And so there's something about, having resources when the recovery starts as being really important to move to success. And now in the small business lending community, we can imagine those resources either coming, because of savings, or coming as the provision of capital for small businesses. So when that recovery moment hits, and that could be felt in different neighborhoods and different cities and different industries at different times. But what are the resources that small businesses will have at their disposal at that moment? And then what do people think about what the data shows in terms of, whether this next phase of moving from relief to recovery, whether that can mitigate some of the K-shapedness that we see or whether it's going to be exacerbated by the endowment effects of the firms that hit the recovery moment with strong resources, really accelerating relative to firms that did not. I'll open that one up for whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I have a thought on that, and I'm curious what other people think. The first thing I think is that relief is probably easier than stimulus, because it's easy to see who's suffering and who's affected poorly by a given circumstance and to target relief towards them. Not really easy, but just easier than the next thing of predicting how a given stimulus is going to multiply throughout the economy. There's a lot of theory about how stimulus multiplies throughout the economy, but there's also a lot of debate about how effective that can be and how efficient it can be. And it's also, very prone to the fallacy of central planning. So I imagine, a lot of well-meaning, but probably not super accurate stimulus going to a lot of places and it not always having the effect that people want it to have. The delivery mechanism for it is important too. It's actually, as you were talking about the effectiveness of PPP, I think about the administration strategy of that versus the vaccine administration strategy. And it's actually a very interesting thing to compare and contrast, whether you prioritize, speed, wideness of distribution, equality, all these different things. And so the thing that I would be optimistic about is that everything that people have learned over the past year has hopefully given small businesses more points of information on where they can go to get credit. I think PPP actually has introduced, just looking at the numbers, a lot of small businesses to fintech lenders that they didn't know about before. And whether it's going to places like Lendio, where there's a marketplace, or going directly to other fintech lenders, I think they now have new and more places to go than perhaps just going to their local bank, which may have been their only option in the past. So that's what I would look at in an optimistic way, that just people should have more information, people should have more choice, and those that are able to take advantage of that will be well positioned.
Yeah, and I think that there's different, you have different tools in your toolbox, right, for different moments. And when COVID kind of came upon us last March, the sky was falling. There were many layoffs. All lenders paused lending 100%. We went from like month over month for all of our lenders, just record months, to basically zero overnight. So capital was not flowing at all. Many layoffs, and I mean, we saw weeks at the very beginning with just tens. I don't remember the exact number. I thought I remember it was it was a lot of layoffs, and I can't quote numbers because someone here will correct me. But anyway, and so it was this moment. Speed was the entire intent of that first round. It was just like, how do we get money into the hands? We can't be prescriptive right now. We're not going to be surgical. We're going to get money into the market and prevent layoffs from happening. Because the mass layoffs and all the hysteria that could have come, if that wouldn't have happened, I think we would have been in a much worse spot. So kind of stop the bleeding. This time around, it is quite a bit more prescriptive in that it is trying to focus on people that are in need, and showing, you have to show at least 25% reduction in revenue, and there's some other criteria that's involved to be able to. It's a little bit more of a mix between relief and stimulus this time around than it was the first time around.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with Brock that the policy seems to be improving, and I wanted to mention to Mayas that I do think macro theory faces some challenges from the real world. You're right about that, and that's one reason I'm a corporate finance empiricist. So I try to understand kind of how policies work, how entrepreneurial finance works more on the ground. But here is a question that most economists are pretty good at asking. We're good at asking, what are the opportunity costs of a given expenditure? So PPP was one of the largest fiscal stimuluses in US history. At $650 billion. It's what we spend on Medicare every year. Where else could that money have gone? What if you invested it in basic research in biotech? What if you used it to double the salary of all public school teachers for the next 20 years? What would be the effects of that be on social welfare? You said that the program worked better than expected and was largely successful. But the existing research, not our paper, but other work, suggests that the amount of taxpayer dollars spent per job saved is like astronomical. And that, despite the amazing work of Lendio and other fintechs in reaching very small firms, overall, the program served in substantial part as a subsidy to banks who gave loans to large firms so that they could pay down debt. And so I guess one question that has come to me that I'd like to ask you folks, perhaps especially Amias, given his previous hat at Treasury, is what you think about companies and maybe people having direct accounts with the Fed or the Treasury in some way in order to pay taxes and get handouts directly. Because the problems that I'm describing and that the other research besides ours has identified is really one of intermediation frictions, where when you introduce this layer of private sector intermediation, you're going to get all kinds of perverse outcomes based on their incentives. And so I'm curious what you think about what we've learned from this crisis about those opportunities.
So Sabrina, I did not think we were going to Fed accounts for all today, but I'm glad you brought it up. For those on who are watching and are not familiar with Fed accounts as an idea, this comes, I think, most clearly through in a paper written by 3 economists, 2 who are close friends of mine, so the idea basically. They didn't think about it in the stimulus context, but was basically that the Fed ultimately holds accounts on behalf of banks, and then banks hold accounts on behalf of people. But that is primarily because in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, the idea of one bank holding millions upon millions of accounts was inconceivable. And so you would always have to outsource the maintenance of low-level accounts to private entities, and then the central bank would only have to handle the thousands of accounts of banks. So that's kind of the fundamental theory of why we have central banks and then banks. And so the thrust of the paper is basically that these days it's not hard to hold millions of of accounts, or even billions of accounts. This is a thing that modern data science can handle. And therefore, the idea of a public-private partnership for the purpose of simply holding accounts is not necessary. Now, it's a pretty radical idea, but I think if you zoom into the stimulus moment, we saw that there was a fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is that we did not have either valid payment, we had no way to construct what I would call a valid payment file. How much money should go to which bank accounts? And ultimately, stimulus is a matter of moving federal dollars into bank accounts. And so given every program designs in some level a way to articulate, well, what is the process that we need in order to create a correct payment file? If you have a correct payment file, making the payment is super easy. And so I think there's been, Sabrina, as you point out, a recognition that we just don't have as good infrastructure as we thought for making those payments. And it's not so much that we can't make the payments quickly. We can. It's that we don't really know which accounts belong to whom, and we can't pass the dollars through them quickly, because it's not the ability to make the payment, it's the ability to make the payment correctly that matters. So this, I think it's a really interesting idea. It's one of those ideas that is both deceptively simple and deceptively radical. But I think it's interesting, and this question of infrastructure is something that is really important for us all to learn, because wouldn't it have been better if we weren't constrained in our policy choices by the question of, well, we need to use the banks because the banks are the processing capacity, or fintech, the processing capacity to figure out who the small businesses are. What if we just knew who all the small businesses were and we could just make payments to them? And so it was either the IRS or the banks. Those were the two choices. And both of those choices had real weaknesses. And we used the IRS for the sort of stimulus checks to individuals, and we used the banks for the stimulus checks to small businesses. And it's a really interesting question. I'd love to hear, especially for Brock or David or Elena, to the extent that this is a new idea to you. What's your reaction? I see Brock smile, so maybe I'll turn it to him next.
It's not a new idea. I mean, it's in theory, I think it's a great idea. And honestly, on any given day, you could tell me to be, I could argue either side. But so in this case, I'm going to argue the other side, because we've got two people arguing for that. I think that in theory, it sounds awesome. And it's streamlined, and it's more efficient, and it's practical, and it's simple and whatnot. In practice, to me, the reality of that sounds like a horrific disaster, because we saw when this whole stimulus thing started last round, they were trying to deploy capital through the SBA, a centralized government agency, and they were deploying EIDL loans. And 1 week into it, that was a dumpster fire disaster of programs going down and breaking. They didn't have people to be able to handle the volume. The SBA site shut down, and they were asking people to fill out your application by pen and paper and mail it to an address. And so I think that I have a tremendous amount of respect for many kind of government agencies, but I also know I've worked with many of them on a regular basis, and the execution of big ideas like that is not necessarily their strong suit. And we can go look through whether it's Obamacare or look at all the different programs that they've tried to kind of go direct to consumer with that haven't gone as planned or as anticipated as you would think it would be on paper. And so I just think that there in theory, I love the idea, and I could argue for it, and I think we will get there, by the way. And so much of what we learned through this pandemic starts to raise the question, for the next crisis, should we be prepared for that? Hopefully we will be. Right now, and we definitely, in the next, I don't know how many years, we're definitely not, in my opinion. And using the private public partnership was, in my opinion, the best way to go. And it comes, I know it comes across self-interest and bias, but I'm taking the other side of that argument.
Yeah, and I just put it for everyone's benefit that the three authors are Morgan Ricks, John Crawford, and Lev Manan, two of whom I worked with at the Treasury, and the third is a great economist out west, I believe, at Berkeley. So so for anyone who wants to check it out, David, let's talk a little bit, back into this idea, and I think Brock raised a really interesting point about just processing capacity. Right? Because at some level, in order for it to be fair, and Sabrina made this point earlier, you have to know something about an entity before you give money, or else you're not sure what will be fair. And so, obviously this is your core business at Ocrolus, is creating the back-end infrastructure for that processing capacity. But what did you see in terms of, your partners, whether they were banks or fintechs or others, in their ability to ramp up processing capacity and the ability to make fine-grained judgments about, PPP round 1, round 2, and then now round 3, where you're processing this question of not just, are you a small business? Do you have employers? But are you a small business whose revenue has dropped? So, David, I'd love to hear, just like from the Ocrolus perspective, how has it been going to be this processing capacity, and what are some of the challenges that you see as we might try to increase complexity in order to increase fairness?
So the challenges have evolved over time. At the very beginning of the first round of PPP, the challenge was very frequently changing requirements, and in some cases in the early stages, very fuzzy requirements. So every lender and every lender's legal team had a very different point of view on what documents a business needed to provide to be eligible, and how much of a duty did the lender have to vet those documents and verify the information and underwrite the borrower, so to speak. And so, and the other challenge for them was, once they understood what documents and data sources they needed, these were not data sources that the lenders were used to utilizing in their typical underwriting process. And so where we were able to help a lot was helping these lenders process these documents, whether it was a 940C or a 941 or something like that, where we just haven't, most lenders that were lending to a typical small business haven't dealt with those document types before. They were able to do it in a really efficient way by processing the data through Ocrolus. I think the issue now is there's even more data that you have to look at, as you spoke about, revenue declining, not just, do you have employees and what's your payroll? So there's more information you need to be able to parse out of documents and data sources and use to apply for the second PPP loan. I think that when you go from PPP to recovery, the lesson for lenders, and I think that something they can take with them, is that you actually need to understand a business in a very extreme level of detail, much more so typically than you would need in a general consumer loan. Obviously, there are very specific types of consumer loans, but the thing is, every small business loan is very specific because every business is specific. And there's such a wide range of businesses in different industries, different operating dynamics, that if you're in the position of extending credit to a business, having the ability to bring together many different data sources to understand the cash flow and the opportunities and the risks of that business on an individual level, but do it without having a huge operational costs of humans looking at all those documents and data sources, making those decisions, that's really important. And I think the most forward-thinking lenders who themselves will thrive and who will be able to extend the most credit to small businesses over the next year and couple of years will be the ones who are able to make those decisions by piecing together a lot of different data sources in constructing a pretty complex, nuanced picture of the borrower.
I'd love to, as we sort of wrap up here with a few minutes left, maybe just talk a little bit about the next 6, 12 months, and maybe turn to you first, Elena. What is the macroeconomic consensus, to the extent there is one? I've heard a lot of people, excited for the roaring 20s again, 100 years later. What should we be thinking and expecting, whether you're a small business or a small business lender? What's the state of the art right now in terms of how quickly we get back to normal and what normal looks like?
Right. So, I mean, normal in a post-COVID world is not the normal that we were used to before. And I don't know about consensus, but a lot of similar sentiment is pegged to the latter half of 2021, where we will see more of that pent-up demand coming out. We do have a pretty big spike in activity in our forecast for the third quarter, later second quarter, early third quarter, because we do see a very encouraging path of vaccinations and more people are willing to get them. And so right now we are optimistic that, we will have a momentum that's going to push us forward. But the thing is, when we talk about the differences in the economy, as I mentioned, we have the goods side of the economy that held up fairly well even during the recession, because people were home, they were buying things, they were saving money from not going on vacations. And then as we unleash this kind of demand, people are able to spend more. You're not going to get 17 haircuts to catch up to the ones that you missed in the last 9 months or so. So what's that going to look like when we unleash this demand? Is it going to be focused on the service sector, or is it still going to be more heavy on the goods, because we are still trying to figure out what that new economy looks like, right? And things that I think about are businesses that had to fail through no fault of their own. If we were in a counterfactual universe where there was no pandemic and these businesses would have gone through as healthy as possible, but they, the owner got discouraged, or the economy just, there was not enough support for them. Can we resuscitate businesses? Can we bring people back from the sidelines? Can we make sure that we have the right training and the right kind of environment to create this dynamism that we really need in the economy, as we now look towards next year and the year after, to make sure that momentum keeps going and that we do get a roaring 20s if there will be.
Brock, from that perspective, you guys run a marketplace, so you're dealing with lenders and small businesses on both sides here. What are the prospects, and what do you see in terms of what you might call a small business in a coma, right? Someone who's maybe still have their lease, but they haven't been open, or they've let go of their employees and they're just running on a shoestring and just trying to keep the thing on life support. Are you finding that there are small business lenders, or that there are some patterns in terms of, when we hit this recovery moment, we might already be there for some, to help those businesses get out of that coma state and back to normal? Are there lenders who can do that, or do small businesses have to get sort of towards normal before lenders can really come in and play a role here? What are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, lenders are back to lending. They're anxious to be able to capture, more market share and extend loans. Now, they're not going to do it to those that they feel are not creditworthy, and a lot of loans these days, especially, are the underwriting is based on the cash flow of the business. And so it's kind of a little bit of a chicken and egg, where the business may not be open, yet they need capital to be able to stay open or get open, but yet they can't really go get a loan yet because they don't have cash flow. And I guess that's why I'm passionate. I see so many of these businesses that are stuck in that exact spot. Like, I need money. I see this recovery happening, the vaccine, the reduction in the number of COVID, all the COVID numbers are going down, and I want to get back to normal. And hopefully, they can use some of that PPP loan to get back to normal, get cash flow going again, and then be able to secure a loan through, one of the lenders. Even a lot of the traditional banks are leveraging much more than ever cash flow data. Although, you know, there are other loans that are collateralized loans or based off of other things, but most lending is really kind of centralized on that cash flow data. But the one I will just insert as well, I'm optimistic that, you know, the SBA loans are allowing lenders to be able to be a little bit more aggressive on some of those products that where cash flow may not totally be back yet. The higher SBA guarantee at 90% and reduced fees and some other things like that are spurring lenders to make loans that they may not have otherwise lent to previous to COVID happenings or the pandemic.
Excellent. So just final comments. I'll go to David and then Sabrina. David, what's next for the Small Business Recovery Index? What are you pushing on? And then I'll ask the same question to you, Sabrina, about where your research is headed next.
Yeah, for the Recovery Index, we will continue adding more data sources to the index, both, you know, external macro sources as well as unique analytics that we're able to do with the data that we see at Acrolis. We are starting to do a monthly research note based on the index and changes in the index, which will go up on our blog, so everyone can follow that. We can also see that if you sign up for the Acrolis newsletter. And I think we will, you know, as we go forward, make it increasingly available to our clients and also promote other research projects using the index data. And it'll be very interesting to see, you know, what the index shows as we perhaps go into a roaring 20s, although I think we probably need a better catchphrase for the decade than that.
And Sabrina, what is next for you? What are you trying to? What's the next question you're asking, and what's the next data source that you need David to produce? Oh, you're on mute.
Well, for this project, we're continuing to bring in bank statement data. Anyone on the call who has bank statement data that might be linkable to PPP borrowers, please write me. The goal, in addition to just expanding the data set, is to really try to start to understand the mechanisms beyond the ones I talked about for these disparities. And what we are looking to do right now is bring in very focused measures of credit relationships. And that's something that Acrolis is able to see in their granular transaction data from bank statements, which really, despite the fact that banks have always had data, they have never used it remarkably, or haven't used it efficiently. And so Acrolis is able to build these sort of analytics around the individual transactions in the bank statements. And we're using that to see, you know, did these firms who are coming to FinTech for PPP previously have exposure to FinTech? Did they have credit relationships in other places? And so that will hopefully help here a little bit. We're then, you know, if that doesn't explain what we're seeing, we will turn to looking at perhaps discrimination on the part of loan officers, using spatial measures of racial animus. We'll look at measures of trust in government, in financial institutions, you know, among communities that have historically kind of been treated badly. So there's a number of avenues to go. And then the bigger next question that I'm hoping to work on, hopefully with Acrolis and other firms, is trying to understand really the benefits of FinTech intermediation relative to conventional types of intermediation. And in particular, I'm thinking of running sort of a very simple horse race between predicting default with recent cash flow versus predicting default with credit reports, and whether differences in sort of who gets access to credit with those two different types of data input has, you know, different implications for the types of communities that wind up, you know, being able to access sort of financial services. So I'll stop there, but I really had a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Excellent, and thanks to David and Tim, as always, for hosting and organizing. And Brock had to go early, unfortunately, but thanks to Brock and Sabrina and Yelena for just a great conversation. This is so fun, and I fear that I'll be back. So hopefully the audience enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much, Miles. And
Excellent.
once again, my appreciation for your moderating skills. That was awesome. A recording of this will be made available, and we'll be reaching out to all of the attendees. Much appreciated, particularly to lenders in the audience. If it's what you heard today is something that is of interest, and I can't imagine why it wouldn't be, and you'd like to find out more about participating in this research, do reach out to us, and we'll be able to share that information with Sabrina and David. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great day.